Look at the back rows next Sunday, not the front. The front always fills. The front is where the families who never miss a week have sat for 30 years. Look at the back 3 rows and count the young men who should be in them, the ones who were there 5 years ago and aren't now, and then look at the building itself. The second ward that used to meet at 1 o'clock and got quietly folded into yours last spring. The parking lot that hasn't been full since before the pandemic. The classroom at the end of the hall that's storage now. Hold that image, because Salt Lake City would very much prefer you look somewhere else. 88,500, a new all-time record for full-time missionaries in the field, announced with statements from senior leadership, celebrated as proof of a rising generation's faith, accompanied by 55 new missions and a worldwide total past 500. More missionaries than at any point in the entire history of the church, and emptier chapels than most of us have ever seen, both of them reported as true in the same season, by the same institution, without anyone at the podium acknowledging that only one of those statements can possibly describe a growing church. This video is about which one, and about the extremely ordinary accounting maneuver that allows both to sit in the same press release without contradiction. Before we get into it, if you've been carrying that empty pew feeling around and wondering whether it's just you, whether you're the problem, whether you're seeing things that aren't there, you aren't, and this channel exists for exactly that conversation. Hit like, subscribe, ring the bell. It determines whether videos like this one reach the people who need them. The official story. Let's give the official narrative its full weight first, because it deserves a fair hearing before anyone takes it apart. The church's position is straightforward and internally coherent. The missionary force has grown, and it has grown because young Latter-day Saints raised in a culture increasingly hostile to religious commitment have chosen commitment anyway. Leadership has pointed in particular to the wave of young sister missionaries as evidence of something remarkable happening among young women, a spiritual awakening visible in the numbers. And if you've spent your life inside this church, that framing will feel not just plausible, but familiar, because it's the story the institution has told about itself continuously since 1830, that the world grows darker while the faithful grow brighter, and that the statistics are the visible edge of divine approval. It's a good story. It has moved people to tears in general conference, and if you accept the number at face value, it holds together completely. The trouble begins the moment you ask a very boring question, not a hostile question, not an anti-Mormon question, not a question that requires you to have lost your testimony or read a single word of critical scholarship, but the question any auditor anywhere in the world asks on the first morning of reviewing any set of books. What, exactly, are we counting? Why the number matters so much in the first place. And before we answer that, it's worth pausing on something that outsiders find genuinely strange about this religion, the fact that the number matters at all. Most faiths do not run on statistics. A Catholic parish does not announce quarterly growth from the pulpit. A synagogue does not project attendance curves. But Latter-day Saints have been trained across 4 generations to read numbers as revelation. The membership total announced every April, the temple count, the convert baptisms, the missionary force, all of it recited from the podium in general conference in the cadence of Scripture, rather than the cadence of a shareholder call, and received by the membership as evidence that the work is true because look how it grows. That training has consequences. It means the number is not merely informational, it is load-bearing theology. It is the answer given to a doubting teenager, the answer given to a wavering convert, the answer given to yourself at 2 in the morning. The church is growing, and no false church grows like this, which is precisely why a declining number would be catastrophic in a way it simply wouldn't be for another denomination, and precisely why the pressure to produce a rising one is enormous and entirely internal. Nobody outside cares how many missionaries are in the field. The audience for this statistic has always been the membership, and the membership has been taught to treat it as a spiritual instrument rather than an operational metric. Keep that in mind for everything that follows, because it explains the incentive better than any accusation of bad faith ever could. When the number is the testimony, the number has to go up. The category problem. So, what are we counting? This is where it gets interesting, and it's where independent researchers, including analysts on podcasts like Mormon.ish and Mormon Stories, have concentrated their attention, because the word missionary is not one thing. It is at least 3 different things wearing the same coat. The first is the proselytizing missionary, the one you picture the instant you hear the word. 19 years old, white shirt, black name tag, knocking doors in a city he'd never heard of 6 months ago, speaking a language he learned in 9 weeks at the MTC, and this is the group the entire mythology is built around. The group that gets the farewell talk and the homecoming talk and the plaque on the ward wall. The second category is the young service missionary, young people who, for reasons that include anxiety, depression, chronic illness, neurodivergence, or simply an inability to withstand the psychological pressure of a traditional mission, are assigned to serve without proselytizing. They live at home. They work in church canneries and family history centers and welfare farms and meeting houses. Their service is real, their contribution is real, and nothing in this video is an argument that they should be diminished or that their calling means less. But here is the load-bearing observation of this entire analysis. Think about what a service mission was a decade ago compared to what it is today. A decade ago, it was an exception, not a track, not a program with dedicated leadership and its own handbook and its own infrastructure, but a case-by-case accommodation arranged for a small number of young people whose circumstances made a conventional mission impossible, so rare that most wards went years without one, and most members couldn't have told you the category existed. Today, it is a system, deliberately expanded, formally structured, actively destigmatized from the pulpit, and it absorbs a population of young people who under the old model would not have appeared in this statistic at all. They would have been sent home early and quietly with a story the family didn't tell and the ward didn't ask about, or they'd have never submitted papers in the first place. That is the arithmetic, and you don't need the precise split to see what it does. A category that was a rounding error has become a structural component of the total, and that total is now being compared against a historical figure from an era when the category was a rounding error. The third category is senior missionaries, retired couples and individuals doing administrative, humanitarian, temple, and record-keeping work, valuable and faithful and utterly sincere, and also critically, not doing the thing the headline number is universally understood to represent. When a member hears 88,000 missionaries, nobody pictures a 72-year-old couple processing microfilm in a basement in Provo, however genuinely useful that work is. Add all three together, publish the sum, set it beside the past, and you have not measured growth. You have measured a change in definition and called it a miracle. The corporate parallel. If any of this sounds familiar, it should, because it is a maneuver with a very long history in an entirely different kind of institution. When a publicly traded company needs to show growth in a quarter where the underlying business is flat, it has options that don't require selling a single additional unit of anything. It can change what counts as a user. It can begin counting free tier accounts alongside paying subscribers. It can fold contractors and interns and part-time consultants into a headcount figure that was previously reserved for full-time employees. Nothing false is stated at any point. The footnote discloses everything to anyone who reads footnotes, and the headline number goes up. The technical term for this is a change in accounting methodology, and the reason auditors require that it be disclosed prominently rather than buried is precisely that it renders year-over-year comparison meaningless. A number that isn't measuring the same thing it measured last year isn't a trend at all. It's two unrelated numbers standing next to each other in a suit. Now, the church is not a public company. It has no shareholders, no disclosure requirement covering its missionary count, no auditor with the standing to force a footnote. And that is exactly why the comparison is worth making, rather than a cheap shot. A corporation doing this would be legally required to flag it, and the church can simply announce the total and let the applause do the rest. It's also worth noting who is making these decisions. The senior leadership of this church is not, and has not been for a long time, a body of theologians. It is disproportionately composed of men who spent their careers as attorneys, corporate executives, university administrators, and judges, men fluent in exactly the kind of institutional presentation this maneuver represents. Men for whom managing a metric is not deception, but competence, the ordinary work of protecting an organization's position. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's a resume. The men are gone. Now we arrive at the part of this story that the celebration is working hardest to obscure, because the church has made the growth in sister missionaries the emotional centerpiece of the entire announcement. Young women serving in unprecedented numbers, framed from the pulpit as a spiritual awakening. And if you look at it demographically instead of devotionally, a very different picture assembles itself. For virtually all of the church's modern history, the mission was a male institution. It was the expected path, the prerequisite for marriageability and leadership and standing in the community, and a young man who declined carried that decision with him for decades in the way people looked at him across the foyer. The social cost of not going was reliably higher than almost any cost of going. That equation has broken, and it's worth being specific about why. Because young people are less religious now is a lazy answer that explains nothing. A young man turning 18 today has spent the whole of his adolescence with the complete documentary record of his own religion sitting one search away. And not in the form of anti-Mormon pamphlets pressed into his hand by a stranger outside the temple, which his father could dismiss and did, but in the form of the church's own gospel topics essays, the seer stone in the hat, the polygamy timeline, Fanny Alger, Helen Mar Kimball's age, the actual translation method, the priesthood ban, and the officially abandoned justifications that were taught as doctrine to his grandparents. He met all of it at 14, on a phone, alone, in a bedroom, years before any adult in an interview asked him whether he had a testimony. And he met it alongside something arguably more corrosive to the institution's recruiting power, the testimony of the people who actually went. Thousands of returned missionaries have spent the past decade describing publicly and in detail what the MTC and the mission field did to them. The sleep deprivation, the baptismal numbers pressure, the companionship dynamics with no exit, the untreated breakdowns, the mission president with no clinical training making psychiatric decisions, the specific shame of coming home early and being received like a casualty of your own weakness. That used to be private suffering, absorbed individually, invisible in aggregate. It is now searchable, indexed, and delivered to 17-year-olds by algorithm. So the prestige is simply gone. The mission is no longer the thing that certifies a young man as a man within his community. It is a thing his entire generation has watched visibly break people, undertaken in service of an institution about which he already possesses documented reasons for distrust. He is not declining out of laziness or worldliness or insufficient faith, whatever the High Council speaker says. He is performing a cost-benefit calculation that his father was never permitted to see the inputs for. And there's a second cost his father never faced. 2 years is a different quantity now than it was in 1985. It is 2 years out of a compounding technical career, 2 years out of a scholarship track, 2 years of an internship pipeline that no longer waits, at an age when peers are building portfolios and credentials that don't pause for anyone. That is what collapsed. And when one of the two major components of a total collapses, while the total itself holds steady or rises, there is exactly one thing that can be happening. The other component is absorbing the gap. Which means the honest reading of the sister missionary surge is not that young women suddenly became more faithful than young men. It is that young women are being asked to fill a hole that young men stopped filling, and that structural substitution is being marketed back to the membership as a spiritual triumph. And there is a bitter irony sitting inside it that deserves saying out loud. This is an institution that reserves every position of real authority for men, that does not permit women to preside over a congregation or hold the priesthood, or make a single binding decision above the auxiliary level. And it is now, in its moment of demographic emergency, depending on those same women to carry the front line of its public work and to keep the headline number intact. They are good enough to save the statistic. They are not good enough to sit in the room where it's announced. What the empty chapels are telling you, which brings us back to the back rows. You cannot have record missionary numbers and record convert-facing manpower while congregations consolidate across the developed world, wards merge, buildings close, and the parking lots empty out. Those two facts cannot both be descriptions of a growing church. Unless, of course, the missionary number stopped measuring conversion capacity somewhere along the way. That's the resolution, and it's not a conspiracy, it's a definition. The number is real. The categories inside it changed. The traditional proselytizing force, the one that actually produces converts and actually fills chapels, is not what it was and has not been for some time, while at the other end of the pipeline, the retention crisis, converts baptized and then never seen again, sometimes within weeks, has been documented for years by researchers working from the church's own published figures. And this is the part that should trouble a believing member most, because it isn't an outside attack on the church's data. It is the church's own data, read carefully. Membership records are notoriously slow to reflect departure. A person who stopped attending in 2011 and never formally resigned is still counted today. Which means the official membership figure is not a count of Latter-day Saints. It is a count of names that have not been removed, and the gap between those two things widens every single year. A missionary force can grow while the church around it shrinks. It happens the moment the missionary force stops being primarily about missions. Here's what I want to leave you with. The expansion of service missions was, on its own terms, a humane decision. And it deserves to be said plainly. Young people who were breaking under the traditional model now have a path that doesn't end in shame. And anyone who has ever watched a 19-year-old come home early and be received by his own ward like a failure should be glad that path exists. Those young people deserve better than to be used as line items, because that is what happened next. The church made a second decision after the first one. It decided to count them the same way, and then to compare that count against a historical figure that meant something entirely different, and then to present the difference to the membership as evidence that God is pleased with them. Every anxious kid stamping envelopes at a family history center, every young woman with a chronic illness sorting cans at a bishop's storehouse is now, without ever having been asked, a data point in a press release, engineered to reassure the very institution that couldn't accommodate their weakness in the first place. And if you are sitting there right now feeling something you can't quite name, the specific vertigo of realizing that a number you were taught to read as the finger of God is a spreadsheet decision made by men in an office building. You are not faithless, and you are not alone, and you are not the first person to notice. You are just someone who read the footnote. 88,500 is not a miracle. It's a category. And the reason your ward feels empty is that categories don't fill pews. If this put words to something you've been noticing for a while and couldn't name, subscribe. There is a great deal more of this record to go through, and we are going to go through all of it.